Okay, so this will be our introductory discussion as we look to begin our next book, That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. It is the third book of a trilogy. And I know that many people have not read the first two. We actually read the first two several years ago. Um, and I kind of declined to finish the series really because of the context of the time. And the deeper we get into this book, you might see why I chose that in 2020 and 2021, it wasn't the best time to talk about this. That will not be evident in the first few chapters, but the deeper we go, I think you'll sort of see why it would have been difficult to talk about the book and not talk about current events. But anyway, this book, however, though it is the third of a trilogy, was written in such a manner where it can be read on its own. It feels very different. It's longer than all the other books. And as I have described it before, it's more novelty than the other books. The other books are the reading, the pace of the plot of the narrative is very rapid. It flows very quickly. It's smooth, but it flows. And this meanders a little more like a contemporary or modern novel. The characters are different. You know, if you expect this to be a direct continuation of your first two books, the first few chapters of this might feel very out of place. Wait a second, who are these people, and what's this setting, and why are we talking about this instead of that? But a part of that is the fact that this book was written with the intention of it being able to be read as a standalone. So if you have not read the first two books, you can absolutely pick up this book and get a lot out of it. I think some pleasurable enjoyment, but also this is going to have us wrestle with some theological concepts and practical applications to the way we choose to live our lives, the way that we make our decisions and see the world around us. And again, it can be read completely on its own. I think by having read the first two books, you get even more out of it. And so what I would like to do, and I often take an introductory class to talk about the author, or maybe to talk about the general concepts or the broad themes that we're going to get into. What I want to do is talk a little bit today about C.S. Lewis and to talk more in depth about the first two books. What I will say in the first two books isn't going to spoil it's not going to spoil the experience of reading these books if you've not. But hopefully it will help you understand the world building and the broad perspectives so that you will get even more out of the book than you would if we just all read it together cold. Some of you have read the books already. A couple of you even said, oh, if I know we're reading the third book, I'll go get the first two and I'll start reading them on my own. That's awesome. So what I'm going to tell you about these books is like the Cliff Notes version, which does not preclude you from actually reading the book. And I think you get a lot out of it. There's a lot that I can't talk about, or a lot that you don't really get unless you are kind of steeped in it and you follow the narrative, whether it's little moments or little scenes. There's a richness to it. You know, when you tell somebody about a movie that you really want them to watch, even if you tell them everything that happens, it's not the same thing as them watching the movie. And you kind of want them to still watch the movie, right? Get all that other stuff that you can't get from somebody giving them a few minute explanation. So we have done multiple C.S. Lewis books over the years. Not everybody obviously has been a part of that. The nice thing about our YouTube channel is it preserves all these classes that I've uploaded, and I have them saved as playlists. So you can look on playlists and you can go back and you can find old books that we've done and listen to whatever you want, including multiple C.S. Lewis books. Now, we've been doing this for so long that some of them aren't on YouTube, because I actually recorded them and I would put them on DVD so people could watch them later or catch up with stuff, which, you know, we don't do anymore because it's so much easier to just put it online. But there are definitely older books there in book studies that if you ever wanted to, or the two books I'm going to talk about are available on our YouTube channel when we did those book studies years ago. And if you ever want to read them and just kind of have, oh, I wonder what that meant on chapter 4, you could actually watch the chapter 4 video and listen to our discussions about it at the time. So I will not give maybe as in-depth a discussion about C.S. Lewis as I might have, just because we've talked about it multiple times. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But let's kind of nutshell this. So C.S. Lewis he was born kind of in the late 19th century in Belfast. So though he would be identified as English, he would probably consider himself an Ulsterman. So he was born in Northern Ireland. Now he spends most of his life in England proper, but he was born and raised in Northern Ireland. So C.S. Lewis, who was never ordained, but over the course of the 40s and the 50s, became possibly the most prominent voice of Christianity throughout the world. He was influencing people worldwide on a level of folks like Billy Graham. First came to national and then international prominence as a Christian author through a series of lectures he gave on the BBC radio during World War II. So like during the Blitz, the BBC was basically saying to kind of help the people, kind of buck up and to get them focused on something better and to also encourage them. They were looking for folks who could give regular talks about things that would be of benefit to the people on the home front in the midst of privation and also the worry about a war that was only happening the distance of the English Channel away. So C.S. Lewis was one of the people they asked, and his lectures were so well received. He began compiling several of them into his first work, which we can purchase today under the title Mere Christianity. But C.S. Lewis, who always considered himself a non-professional, he didn't even like to be considered a theologian. He was an English scholar, a scholar of English, particularly in medieval and Old English. He was principally employed as an Oxford Don. That was an instructor in one of the many colleges. He spent most of his time in Magdalen College in Oxford, where he would, in the Oxford style, basically sit in a class just like this with these students, and they would teach through discussion. He was the expert in the field. And then rather than just give lectures, he would expect and really demand an interactive discussion with all of these students. So you better eat your Wheaties and you better study your stuff, because you can't sit and hide in the back of the lecture hall, because the expectation of the class was not that you were taking notes. You were directly engaged in the content, and there was intended to be a back and forth, and you were going to learn you were going to answer questions and you were going to ask questions, and it was going to be a back and forth that you would learn from and everybody else would as well. And that was a style that they've been doing for, since the earth cooled. Oxford's like 1,000 years old, and they've been using this system of teaching for a long, long time. And that was really where he shined, was being able to dig very deeply into complicated and obscure things and then discuss them in a manner in which people could understand and grapple with him. So my favorite quality about C.S. Lewis, and the one that I hope I can emulate in some fashion, is his uncanny ability to take difficult and complicated issues and explain them in ways that almost anyone can roughly grasp. Like a concept is like, oh, there's just no way I could possibly fathom that. Well, he's got a way, like an illustration, or he's got a story, or he's got some way. It's not really dumbing it down so much as it is getting to its essence and then explaining the essence like Jesus might give a parable with illustrations that we understand here and now. And he was excellent at that within his own field, where he was truly a world-class scholar. He was quite possibly the most learned man on the planet. But also through his own Christian faith, to take sometimes very complicated and deep theological concepts and explain their essence with such simplicity that people who didn't feel educated could understand what he was talking about and then try to connect to learn more. And that was really, I think, his genius as a Christian communicator. And what will come out through a lot of his works. Some of his works were deeply academic, but those were mostly in his field. He also loved to write poetry, though he admitted he wasn't very good at it. And some of his more in-depth works might have been, kind of nonfiction Christian reflections, but they were, of varying degrees of difficulty to read and the depth of complexity, to writing what he would call fairy tales and children's stories. He had the heart of a child that always remembered that the greatest stories were ones that could be appreciated by children and adults alike. There was an amazing quality about the way that he wrote his children's stories. They were written simply. You read the Narnia books, and they are on a grade level appropriate for kids to, if not read themselves, listen to it being read to them and being able to follow along. Yet they're never dumbed down. They never treat kids as being stupid, but just kids as being kids. And he had this very purposeful principle that children deserved good stories. And he was always annoyed at children's stories that were, kind of too simple, too pablum, namby-pamby, babyish, because he understood that kids love good stories too. How you tell them might need to be shaped in a way where they can perceive it and understand it, but the quality of the story shouldn't change whether you're writing a story for an adult or for a child. One of the best analogs for the way that he wrote, especially children's books like the Narnia books, are Looney Tunes. The Looney Tunes shorts with Bugs Bunny, the ones that were from the 40s, the 30s even, they were shown to general audiences. My generation only saw them on Saturday morning cartoons as they were collected, but those things were decades old even then, and they would just broadcast them on TV, and they're available even now. And you can watch them with kids and with grandkids, and everybody thinks it's funny. Now, how smart is writing where people in their 70s and people who are 7 all think the same thing is funny? That's crazy hard to do. But the Looney Tunes did that really well for a long time. Those shorts, the classic ones that we can think of, were shown before movies of general audiences, where all ages were there. And it wasn't like the adults like, oh, it's a cartoon, forget it. They all loved it. Yeah. And they stand the test of time. You can watch them even now. And the real good ones from the 40s are super funny today, and they were super funny then, and they make little kids laugh, and they make everybody. And there's a particular genius about being able to do that. And I think there's an immense crossover in Lewis's perspective as an author, that quality was quality. Now, for someone whose explanations of the faith made such a deep impact throughout the world and continues to be a bestseller, it's now been It's now been 60 years since his death. His death, which was underplayed in the worldwide news because he died on November 22nd, 1963. And all the news reports were about John F. Kennedy. But for somebody whose profound effect of being a Christian apologist, an apologist is someone who makes the case for something, to explain in such a way where those who are not of the faith can understand the faith, perhaps come to it, or those who are a part of the faith can understand it even better, that he spent years of his life as an absolutely committed atheist. So he was raised in the church, which, with what he describes in his own autobiography, was a very, childlike but sincere faith, but was rocked to its core at the illness and eventual death of his mother. So C.S. Lewis loses his faith as a boy. I think he's like 8 or 9, something like that, when his mother dies, I believe, from cancer. So in watching her fade away, in all of the prayers that he so fervently offered being answered, not in her recovery, but in her death, his anger shut himself off completely from God. Now, it's also a part of his life and testimony that there was a distance that grew from his father, between the father and his sons, C.S. Lewis and his beloved brother Warning, where they were basically left on their own at that point. Now, as adults, we can imagine the difficulty of a single father who never expected to have to raise children, especially when we're talking about the turn of the century. And I think we would have sympathy as Lewis, basically, by the way, who to his friends always went by Jack. But C.S. Lewis, who will acknowledge later, basically, like, he kind of did the best he could. But as a small boy who's now lost his mother and your father is so distant, you don't understand that. All you understand is the loss. So a lot of that was then applied to his very sharp loss and change of faith. He was then sent away to study from tutors. One of his tutors being an enormous influence on his life, another very virulent atheist who was a Scottish scholar whose last name is Kirk, who actually gets sort of redeemed in his writings, comes in a different form in his Narnia writings as an homage to the sharpening of logic that this tutor insisted upon, that made such an impact on Lewis's life that it basically changed the way he saw everything, and he argued everything forever. But after a series of tutors, his exceptional abilities and his intelligence had him kind of fast-tracked to the university and to its highest achievements, to which he did, again, exceptionally well. Again, this was, maybe the most learned, if not the brightest man in the world, quite possibly. Who then, like nearly every man of his generation, was called into service in the trenches of World War I, where he saw firsthand the inhumanity of man, the evil that exists within the world, and the horror of suffering and pain and death. his best friend, does not make it home. And in what will be a decades-long relationship, promises that friend to watch over his mother, which he fulfills until she dies, decades later. So returning back to England after the war and taking his position in Oxford, being incredibly bright, quick-witted, just super interesting, and a man who just enjoyed life. He fell into a crowd relatively easily of these other young, bright men. But there was something about this particular group as they talked and laughed and debated and cut each other down into pieces as the English do like no other. This group was also comprised of deeply faithful Christians. Owen Barfield, Charles Williams, and one in particular, J.R.R. Tolkien. And these guys worked on Lewis, not in a sense of how can I evangelize him, and so much as it was their manner of life, the way they talked, the issues that they raised. They confronted him again and again and again. And this man who had so thoroughly shut and locked the door against the even possibility of God felt this working on him over and over again. The logic that they stated seemed to be irrefutable. The arguments were so compelling. Honesty and integrity demanded that he take them seriously. And as he did, he tells a very beautiful autobiographical story of his own conversion. It's worth reading. It's only like a page long I believe it's in Surprised by Joy, but he recounts a particular time of the term of the school year that it was, and a feeling of being despondent. He was at an utter loss. He was beyond angry. He was to the point of surrender, falling to his knees, knowing that he had to acknowledge that God was God, and that was truly that. And he was mad. He was mad that he couldn't argue his way out of it. He was mad that he could not logic his way out of it. He was mad that the case they had made for Christ was so compelling that the truth of it had actually pulled him to a place that he never wanted to be. And as he puts it in this story, he basically says, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but it was a testimony to the graciousness of God that is beyond our understanding. That it's one thing to imagine a God dealing with a prodigal who, after acknowledging his failure, has come back home. But to love someone who is still trying to pull away and looking around for any way to escape showed the true depth of God's mercy. Because he didn't come as a willing convert. He didn't come happily, and he didn't come easily. He was a little bitter and resentful that he could no longer argue that God didn't exist. Now, that really brought him to what he would refer to as general theism. It took a little longer for him to become an actual committed Christian, but he did. He was since then a very faithful church-going member of the Church of England, and someone who took great stock in the traditional practices of the church. Not just because they were traditional practices, but because he saw their effect on soul and body. In something as simple as before bed, he would kneel at the side of his bed and say his prayers like a small boy. When others saw that, they always thought it was, kind of cute. He found it to be a profound discipline, that his body was being used to worship just as his mind and his heart were. And there was a profound gift in connecting all of those pieces together. Well, this lifelong committed bachelor who was, basically living with his brother, was corresponding with people all over the world at this point, will also tell the story of a marriage of convenience to an American divorcee, Joy Gresham. This was captured in the movie Shadowlands, if you've ever watched that. It was a pretty good rendering with Anthony Hopkins. Really well done. Where he basically married her so that she and her sons could stay in England. They would not be exposed to go back to a difficult situation in America with a husband that she had run from. And he intended to just give her a home and a place to be. And in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, which was both the surprise of encountering the experience of God, which he considered joy, using the German word Sehnsucht, which is this deep longing for something that you can't quite put your finger on, that is only satisfied in the presence of God.
Spell that, please.
Nope.
No. Can you say
it's like Znzucht, maybe.
Okay.
Sehnsucht.
That's good.
Longing and desire. He writes a beautiful comment about this, about it's like a tune that we know that we've never heard, news from a country that we've never visited. This is the sensation where we realize we are not fully at home in this world and that we are built for more. And that desire for more is how we have been built to respond to the presence of God. That's joy in that presence. And he writes his autobiography to be surprised by that, but also by Joy Gresham, the wife that he married as a convenience, that he realizes he truly loves. And as he falls in love with her, deeply in love as a wife that he desires to have and to hold forever, she's diagnosed with cancer. And these things all happen at the same time. So just as he gained a wife, he begins the process of losing her. And so this is kind of the background of what we're going to find in C.S. Lewis, who was a man who identified himself as not just a medievalist, but perhaps the last pre-modern thinker. He liked to refer to himself as a dinosaur, not just in his habits, but the way that he saw the world didn't reflect modernity. It reflected an earlier time before that. And he said, you don't have to respect what I say, but you ought to see me as like a zoo exhibit, where you could learn something by simply observing me that you didn't know before, because my species is pretty much extinct. I bring that up because what he will write about in the Space Trilogy is really kind of resurrecting a more medieval concept of the universe as the heavens. That there is a spiritual dimension that is even more real and more true than what we see. And that'll be some of the background to talk about when we actually get to, discussing the background of the first two books and we get to our book itself. So this book, this trilogy, basically stems from a bet. He and his friend C.S. Lewis, and again, these guys met all the time. Their little group, the Inklings, they called themselves, met at their favorite pub and constantly ragged on each other and dug at each other. They would present each other their papers, their writings. They'd rip them to shreds for each other. And they were deep, deep friends in the ways that these academics can be. And he and Tolkien, and they basically hated each other's writing style. Tolkien hated the Narnia books for being a mishmash of too many mythologies that didn't have a coherent logic inside of it, and he really hated allegory. Tolkien just always found allegory to be like the lowest form of argument. And Lewis he liked The Hobbit, okay. He hated the Lord of the Rings stuff because Tolkien was always trying to read him his poetry, which Lewis found overlong and very dull. And so they dig on each other, but as deep friends. So they were discussing kind of the state of modern literature. And in their estimation, it was pretty low affair. And so they thought, we could do better than this. So they challenged each other to write a book completely outside of their genre and comfort level. So Tolkien was challenged to write a time travel story, which he never did. And Lewis was challenged to write a science fiction story, which he did, which he entitled Out of the Silent Planet, which he enjoyed writing so much. When you read it, especially the way it ends, it's basically intended to end and be done. But there was such a response to it, he wrote more. And so it winds up being this trilogy, and unexpectedly so. It's like he's doing something on a dare, and it winds up being your new career. So Lewis pays homage to his friend and their bet in the character of Elwyn Ransom, the protagonist of the first two books. Elwyn Ransom, who, like Tolkien, was a philologist. That is a scholar of languages. Before the field of linguistics, there was the field of philology, or the love of speech and language. And these were the folks who studied where languages came from, how they developed, how they interacted, how they worked together. The kind of the famous background behind the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit was Tolkien inventing a language. And in the invention of a language that must meet his exacting standards, he wasn't just making up sounds and funny words. No. Tolkien was a world-class philologist. Therefore, any made-up language had to actually work. It had to be so complete and so full as to have a background where it came from. Why would someone use this word or this root to describe this thing? Why would their grammar operate in such a fashion? And so the story of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings story and the Silmarillion, which is even bigger than that, all stem first from Tolkien just being a super language nerd who wanted to write his own made-up language, but to make it so completely thoroughly that it basically invented histories and stories in a world to spring from it. Who decided, when he was told first by his sons, who loved reading these little stories that he would write and send to them while they were fighting in World War II overseas. His son was an RAF pilot. You got to publish this. And so he decided to put them together and write. It was going to be a children's book. In the hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And as he describes this hobbit, his somewhat officious manner, his love of good food, of gardening, of a quiet life, of smoking a pipe, of not being bothered with the concept of adventures, though had an adventurous streak from his youth, patterns Bilbo Baggins after his friend C.S. Lewis. So Lewis returns the favor and makes Elwin Ransom not just a philologist, but when you're given the physical description of Elwin Ransom in the beginning of the first book, it is to a T, J.R.R. Tolkien. So that was just C.S. Lewis background. We've barely done anything at all about these books. Let me see what I can do. This is what I think is helpful to know about the books leading to the third book. As I've mentioned, there's a worldview attached to this, which is encountering the universe as the heavens. It doesn't change a bit what we see, just what it means. This is reflected in a quote from one of his Narnia books, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Eustace, the little know-it-all, meets this kind of magician who eventually describes himself as a retired star. And Eustace says, well, that's really neat because in our world, stars are these flaming balls of gas. And the line is, son, even in your world, that's not all stars are. And we mentioned this somewhat offhandedly the other day. A star is not just the flaming ball of gas. It is that. It's never less than that, but it's so much more. Throughout human history, stars have been inspiration to great art and literature. Children wish upon stars and make their fondest secret hopes. We consider the stars to be a way of guidance. They, for millennia, have helped us navigate and to get to new adventures and safely back home. We've looked to the stars and we've seen stories and mythologies. We look even now and see scientific discovery and human potential. A star is more than a flaming ball of gas. The material world is not all that there is. And that is at the heart of this first book, Out of the Silent Planet. The material world is true, but it's not all there is. The stuff and matter of life is not the sum total of reality. And we encounter that through a science fiction story, through like a little adventure story even. And it begins simply with Ransom taking a walk and walking a little further than he should and going out a little later than he ought and getting caught and stuck in a storm and needing to find a little shelter, finding a secluded house that looks like it's occupied and just hoping that he can, hold out from the storm, or maybe they have a phone or whatever it is. Turns out to be occupied by a couple of other academics. One that he knows from his own past. He didn't really like the guy, but he remembers him. And so there's already kind of this familiarity to it. And then his colleague, who he doesn't particularly care for either, who seems a little full of himself, some scientist of some sort. And before he knows it, he's been knocked unconscious and kidnapped. He has been kidnapped, and he finds himself in a space vehicle heading inexorably to Mars. Now, these two other scientists have been working on this for years. They needed a third person. They had actually been watching him in particular. They had been to Mars before. Mars is inhabited. To effectively communicate with the residents, they really needed a scholar of languages. And this guy, unmarried, alone, philologist, he'd be perfect. So he is kidnapped and forced on this journey. After they arrive, Ransom has overheard them quietly talking to each other and getting the very clear sense they don't really want him as an interpreter. He's intended to be a sacrifice. So at his first opportunity, he makes a run for it. Because he figures, I might not survive, but I'm definitely not going to live if I stay. And in making a run for it, he is able to elude his captors, but then finds himself alone on this alien world. He finds some of these new inhabitants, and he's taken in with great kindness to basically kind of a animal appearing aliens. He sort of describes them as almost looking like seals, dogs, who are clearly intelligent, though seem to have a somewhat primitive lifestyle where they fish, and they make their clothes and their homes and stuff like that. And he winds up spending several weeks with them, learning their language and becoming a part of their tribe. He learns to respect them. He learns to be very impressed by them and their earnestness and their forthrightness. And he also starts to get a sense of the wider Martian landscape, that there are other creatures who are very different than them. There seem to be three radically different types of sentient, intelligent creatures who live on Mars, and they all work in this surprisingly interdependent fashion. Each are radically different, each have different abilities and skills, but each basically happily cooperate with the others so that what needs to be done is always done. The very almost kind of spectral and bird-like Sorns are the philosophers. They are the thinkers. The sort of frog-like and angular Pfiffeltriggi are the builders. And they can take the ideas of the Sorn and they can actually engineer them and create them. The Hrossa, these seal dog-like creatures that Ransom has been living with, they seem to be both the more practical ones with the farming and the fishing, but they also have a poetry to them where they're more interested in history, oral traditions, and this very earthy, very passionate poetry that kind of sets them apart from the other three. None of them see themselves as better or worse than the other, but all interdependent on each other. And then Ransom is having to learn that there's a fourth type of being that he doesn't seem to be able to perceive, but periodically the other creatures will speak to as though there's someone there. The Eldil, which are eventually revealed to be basically spiritual beings. He can't see them because he can't perceive them, but these other creatures, they all can. And these Eldil are constantly guiding Ransom to go to a particular place at a particular time to meet with Oyarsa, which he remembers from bits and pieces seemed to be something that Weston and Devine, the two scientists, were after as well. He's learned to trust the Hrossa, he's learned to love them, and eventually just, well, if this is what I'm supposed to do, then this is what I will do. I don't understand it, but I will go. Even the trip there becomes kind of an adventure where Weston and Devine are still trying to find him. And eventually, as he is able to spend time and work with the other two types of creatures and really gets a sense of the beauty of the Martian landscape, but also the understanding that this is a world that's very, very old, far older than us, but it's been very stable, very peaceful, almost idyllic. How could a world so old, a world that maybe kind of feels like it's starting to die, but would be a place of such great peace? Whatever turmoil is happening in Malacandra, their word for Mars, is what we've brought with us. And so he finally does meet Oyarsa, the ruler of this world, a spiritual being, an Eldiel of such power beyond his understanding that it forces almost an avatar of an image just to be able to interact on any level that Ransom can actually understand. And now Weston and Divine are brought forward as well because they've been captured and all brought to Oyarsa, the ruler of Mars of Malacandra, to explain so that Oyarsa would know. For they come from a world that Oyarsa knows of, but not what it's like. For all the worlds of the solar system are in constant fellowship with one another, just as the beings on Mars are in fellowship with each other, but not Earth. Earth is the silent planet that does not speak with us. Earth, like all the other planets in the solar system, have a spiritual authority and a ruler. Oyarsa is the spiritual ruler and authority of Malacandra and oversees and directs all of these other sentient life forms, and they live in a sense of harmony with each other and with the planet. There is also a spiritual ruler and Oyarsa of Earth. He is Lucifer. And he holds that world under siege. And that's why it's silent. For he has cut that world off from the rest of us. The spiritual beings that rule these planets are like archangels. And in the harmony of God's universe and his cosmos of the heavens, there is this perfect fellowship. Except Earth, which has silenced itself and holds itself under siege. None can leave and none can enter. Now, Oyarsa, Malacandra, he says, you can understand me as, for I am Mars as much as the planet is. I don't know why Maleldil, the ruler of all, has allowed this to happen. None of us do. But we do know that it is. What can you tell me? We don't understand why you're here. And what can you tell me about the silent Earth? Now, Weston has really taken the stage here. Weston and Divine are materialists. All that matters and all that there is matter, is stuff. We're just chemicals. We are evolutionary imperatives. There is no spirit, there is no divine, there is only power. Divine is the basest, crassest sort of man who is just really in it for the money. It turns out that what started off as a true scientific endeavor, could we make it to Mars? Well, when they did, they found out that there's gold everywhere. So all Divine wants to do is to bring it back and to be rich. Weston is about conquest. He doesn't care about the gold, but he does care that gold gives him more resources, and those resources might build more ships, and those ships might go further. All three are told to give an account to Oyarsa, who they are, why they are here, and be judged. The best thing that I can do is to give you Weston's speech. Ransom is asked to translate because Weston, while he understands a little of the language, he wants to make a full case for himself. And the only way he can do that is in English. And so Ransom is asked to take what he says and then repeat it to Oyarsa and to all the people of Malacandra who are listening. This is going to give you a sense about who Weston is, what he's about, and how Ransom, as a Christian, is able to then translate this speech to Oyarsa. Weston. To you, I may seem a vulgar robber, but I bear on my shoulders the destiny of the human race. Your tribal life with its Stone Age weapons and beehive huts, its primitive coracles and elementary social structure has nothing to compare with our civilization, with our science, medicine, and law, our armies, our architecture, our commerce, our transport system, which is rapidly annihilating space and time. Our right to supersede you is the right of the higher over the lower. Does that give you a sense of who Weston is? Ransom is legitimately trying his best to explain this within the confines of the language. And this is what he says. Among us, Oyarsa, there's a kind of now creature, intelligent person, who will take another now's food and things when they are not looking. He says he is not an ordinary kind. He is not an ordinary one of that kind. He says what he does now will make very different things happen to those of our people who are not yet born. He says that among you, Hanau of one kindred all live together, and the Hrasa have spears like those we used a very long time ago, and your huts are small and round, and your boats small and light like our old ones, and you only have one ruler. He says it is different with us. He says we know much. There's a thing that happens in our world where the body of a living creature feels pain and becomes weak, and we sometimes know how to stop it. He says we have many bent people, and we kill them or shut them in huts. We have people for settling quarrels between the bent Hanau and their huts and mates and things. He says we have many ways for the Hanau of one land to kill those of another, and some are trained to do it. He says we build very big and strong huts of stone and other things, like the Fifiltrigi. He says we can exchange many things among ourselves and carry heavy weights very quickly a long way. Because of all of this, he says, it would not be the act of a bent Hanau if our people killed all of your people. Which is what Weston said. But when you hear it in such simple terms, we realize how stupid. The grandeur of his words that sound so profound and so eloquent, when they're explained in their simple truths, are just ugly and dull and wrong. Life, Weston says, is greater than any system of morality. Her claims are absolute. It is not by tribal taboos and copybook maxims that she has pursued her relentless march from amoeba to man and from man to civilization. She has ruthlessly broken down all obstacles and liquidated all failures today in her highest form, civilized man, and in me as his representative. She presses forward to that interplanetary leap who will perhaps place her even far beyond the reach of death. It is her right, or the right, if you will, the might of life itself, that I'm prepared without flinching to plant the flag of man on the soil of Malacandra, to march on, step by step, superseding where is necessary the lower forms of life that we find, claiming planet after planet, system after system, till our posterity, whatever strange form and yet unguessed mentality they might have guessed, dwell within the universe wherever it is noticeable. I may fall, but while I live, I will not, with such a key in my hand, consent to close the gates of the future of my race. What lies in that future beyond our present ken passes imagination to conceive. It is enough for me to know that there is such a beyond. The nobility for life. And again, Ransom has to break every few minutes and explain this, and he explains it with the simplicity of their language. And when you hear those words explained without their layered over gilded eloquence, you hear how stupid it all is. Weston is a materialist, Divine is a materialist. Express it in two different directions. For Divine as a materialist, it's just this life and all I can get, I might as well be rich and comfortable. For Weston, all that there is matter and stuff. So we must press forward and achieve. Our evolutionary impulse says, maybe we can beat death itself if our technology advances enough. But even if it doesn't advance enough for me, the genes within me want our species to persevere. We must. It is our manifest destiny to persevere, even if it means wiping out other life on other planets, because we must survive. Humanity must evolve and change because it must live. So the materialist who says all that there is this stuff, and you get the thief, and you get basically the brutal dictator. And eventually Ransom gives his answer, which is, "Oh, Yarsa, please just kill us all.
Oh.
I have found in this world what Earth should have been, a world that never fell, where the different species can live in harmony, even though they're different. There's not wars, there's not battles, nobody steals or snatches or hurts. As a matter of fact, they have no word for evil. That's where bent comes from. The best they could do is explain the actions of Weston and Divine as being bent, because there is no evil in this world. And though it is a world that is getting near to its mortal conclusion, it's an old world which will be one day empty and dead. They don't fear death, for it is just fellowship with Maleldil and the other Eldils that we cannot see and those who have gone on before. Imagine a world that never falls. Even as it grows old and maybe nears its conclusion, there is death, there is life, but it's harmonious and peaceful. In their obedience to the will of the ruler of this world, who is in himself in obedience to the ruler of all, they don't just get along, they thrive as they ought to. And Ransom says, we're ruining that. I would rather you kill us than risk harming this world anymore. Oyarsa, however, has a different plan. He will give them one opportunity. He will send them back. I will give you the 90 days worth of oxygen and water and whatever it is you need. And it turns out to be, the calculations mean they might not make it, but they choose the chance at life, all three of them. And they do make it back just in the nick of time. And so it's now up to Ransom to tell others what has happened, what he's seen, and to warn against people like Weston and Divine, and what sort of havoc and evil that they can bring to the world, our world, and others. But it's a beautiful, quiet scene before they are finally sent away, where Oyarsa wishes to speak to Ransom privately. And he says, we in the heavens have heard strange tales about what Maleldil has done on your silent world that we know nothing of. We've heard strange tales that Maleldil himself walked on your silent planet and has not forgotten you. And there's a plan beyond what we understand. And what amounts to an off-camera moment, Ransom explains the gospel. And Oyarsa, this amazing spiritual being who is able to basically control an entire planet, is filled with wonder of the humility of God, of the incarnation, of the plan of redemption. These are wonders that Oyarsa never would have fathomed. And that's really the first book. That's the world we're getting into. That's the world we're getting into. It's pretty fast paced. I think it moves well. Anybody know off the top of your head how long that first chapter is out of the Silent Planet? I mean, that Hideous Strength. The first chapter of that Hideous Strength. It's about 30?
No, it's about 20 pages. Yeah.
20 pages. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's let's try to read the 20 pages, but I really want to talk about Paralandra, the second book. And we may or may not get to talking about the chapter next week, because this is plenty for today. Paralandra, the second book, is a second adventure on a different planet, and it feels very different than the first one. And it's worth talking about because there are a few things that will be carried over directly from that book. And again, if you have not read it, they're absolutely worth reading. But do we want to be prepared for a chapter and not get to it, or do you just want to put off chapter 1 another week? It's up to you guys, but I really think we would benefit from at least some discussion on Paralandra.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll have one more introduction day again, because this is the first time we've ever tried to pick up the third book of a trilogy, and I want to, I want to make sure that we're feeling like we're ready. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.